about the fact that David, again, had been, Saul had come to after David with over 3,000 men. And David slipped into his camp with Abishai, and they stole his spear and some water. And then he yelled out to him and looked like there was going to be peace. But then David does something. He's distressed, and he does something that I question why he did it. But he goes to the Philistines, and he joins the Philistines. And so while he's with the Philistines, he's going out and he's doing battle against the enemies of Israel. But he's coming back to the Philistine lord to whom he's serving under, and he's telling them that he's raiding the Israelites. And so he's got this kind of double thing going on. He goes to war with the Philistines who are about ready to go in and attack Israel. And that's a no-win situation for David, because then he either has to fight against his brothers, or he either has to fight against the Philistines with his brothers. And as I was thinking about this story, it's pretty obvious that God doesn't want David involved in this, because this is going to be the end of Saul. Saul and his sons are going to be killed, and David doesn't need to be there or be on the scene. So some of the other lords of the Philistines come to the one that David is serving and say, we don't want him with us. Send him away. And so what we've seen in this story of David so far is we've seen sometimes God is very obvious in the way that he moves, and sometimes it looks like God is moving behind the scenes. He's obvious when he tells Samuel, I want you to go and anoint a new man that's going to be the king of Israel, a man I've chosen, a man after my own heart. And he specifically zeroes in on David. And so that's very obvious from God doing this. But then this thing with the whole thing with the Philistines and then moving David out of the battle so he wouldn't be there, I still see God's hand on in this process, but he's not credited for it, in Scripture. And so we see that God can move openly, and he can move behind the scenes. He can use a prophet like Samuel. He can use Philistines who are not his people at all. So God is not limited in whom he's going to work through. And I think that's kind of interesting, because we tend to think that because we're his children, that we're the primary ones that he works through, but he can work through anyone he chooses, even if they're not his. And we see some of that. When we come to the 31st chapter of 1 Samuel, we come to where the battle begins now. Remember, the night before, Samuel went to a seer, a median, and asked for Samuel to be called up from the dead. And so God allows this to happen, and Samuel does not give Saul good news. He said, by this time tomorrow you'll be joining me in the grave. And so we don't know what Saul did. We know it scared him so much that he passed out, but he knew that he had less than 24 hours to live. And you would think, and we talked about that a little bit last time, but you would think that he would have probably been on his knees and repenting. But we see nowhere where Saul, who started out very well, by the way, who started out with the Spirit of God on his life, but ultimately rebelled so much against God that God removed his Spirit and told him he's going to take away his kingdom. And it's amazing that a person can start out that way and wind up so hard, so distant, so far from God. Because he started out with the number one prophet in the land, the very spokesman for God at his side, leading him, teaching him, and then he just absolutely turned away from it all. And so now we're going to come to his death. In 31 it says, the Philistines were fighting against Israel, and the men of Israel fled before the Philistines and fell slain on Mount Gilboa. So it's not boding well for the Israelites, right? They're in this battle. The Philistines are winning. And in fact, they're winning so bad that the guys are in retreat. And the Philistines are coming after them, and they're killing them as they come. And so it's going to be a big, big defeat for Israel. Think about this. Because Saul was far from God, he led these men into defeat. And it cost them their life. And so when we move away from God, it does not just affect us. It affects everyone within our circle of influence, if you will. If we choose, like Saul, to move away, if we choose to go it on our own, then we're just never by ourselves. We are always affecting someone. It never just affects me. It never just affects you only. It affects a lot of people. And so we see these Israelites being slain. The Philistines overtook Saul and his sons, and the Philistines killed Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua, the sons of Saul. So there's 3 sons of Saul. There's a 4th one we're going to find out in 2 Samuel, but there's 3 sons, and they all are slain. Okay? So what do you think? Why do you think God allowed that, caused that? What do you think that's all about? Line of succession, exactly, yeah. Jonathan, we know, was a good guy. And Jonathan was a brave man, a very, very valiant warrior. And he would have been the next in line. And so it might have been, if Jonathan would have lived, you've got some people that are going to be pulling for Jonathan because they knew Jonathan, they saw Jonathan, he was next in line, the way kings were normally selected. And so there could have been a tear there. And so God then he's actually clearing the way for David. And we don't think sometimes that God moves people out of the way that way, but it looks like that's what has happened here. He's clearing out the way so that when David comes to the throne, there's no opposition to him. Okay? Because David has already been anointed. David has already been chosen by God to be the second king. Okay? So the 3 sons die. And the battle went heavily against Saul. And the archers hit him, and he was badly wounded by the archers. So you got to imagine this. Saul's out. He's out in the battle. He's seeing his troops leave. We don't know whether he saw his sons die or not. They may have been beside of him. We don't know. We're not told how that happened. But then all of a sudden, a series of arrows come in and hit Saul. So it looks like it's multiple times that he gets wounded here, and he's badly wounded, it says. Okay. And then Saul said to his armor bearer, "Draw your sword and pierce me through with it. Otherwise, these uncircumcised will come and pierce me through and make sport of me." But his armor bearer would not, for he was greatly afraid. So Saul took his sword and fell on it. Okay? So I was reading one commentator who said that Saul was already mortally wounded, and he was just ending what was going to come early, because he did not want to suffer. He did not want to be defeated at the hands of the Philistines, and so he does this. When the armor bearer saw that Saul was dead, he also fell on his sword and died with him. And so when you think about the tragedy that's going on, we got a guy who started out really, really good and really, really strong, and he comes up in a very, very bad ending. One of the things that we have to think about is that we want to finish well. And we see that happen sometimes. Some guys start out strong and they don't finish strong. Some guys start out kind of weak, but they finish strong. We want to finish strong. We want to finish well in our walk with God. We don't want to, do like Saul and fall away. Okay, so his life, which could have been an amazing life, he made decisions and choices that ultimately God removed the blessing, the favor, even the anointing. Okay? Thus Saul died with his 3 sons, his armor bearer, and all his men on that day together. So apparently most of the army of Israel died that day. I've not seen how many there were at that time. We know there are times that he had 3,000 men. We know there's times he had 10,000 men. We don't know how many, but we know that it was a rout. Okay? It was a rout. And so this takes place. When the men of Israel who were on the other side of the valley with those who were beyond the Jordan saw that the men of Israel had fled and that Saul and his sons were dead, they abandoned the cities and fled, and then the Philistines came and lived in them. So you've got part of the promised land that some of these Jews lived in, and when they see what's happened, they leave. They're running basically for their life. The Philistines come in, and so they're assuming part of the land. They've been battling over this from way back. Still battling now. And so we see this taking place here. Okay? And it came about on the next day when the Philistines came to strip the slain, that they found Saul and his 3 sons fallen on Mount Gilboa. And they cut off his head and stripped off his weapons and sent them throughout the land of the Philistines to carry to the good news to the house of their idols and to their people. Okay, so what are they doing now? So that was normally they'd go through and they'd take what was worth anything. And so these guys come upon Saul, and so they decapitate him. They cut his head off. And then they take his weapons, and what they're doing is they're sending his weapons to the home of one of the gods or goddesses that they worship to claim victory that God was greater than the God of Israel. So we've got to sometimes understand what's going on behind the scenes. And so this is more than a earthly battle. There is a spiritual battle going on. And now the Philistines are claiming that their God is greater than Israel's God. Because if Israel's God was greater, then Israel would have defeated him. That's the mindset that we have back in this time. Okay? Questions? Comments? Okay, as I said, then they put the weapons in the temple of Ashtaroth, and they fastened the body to the wall of Beth-shan. Now, when the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead heard what the Philistines had done to Saul, all the valiant men rose and walked all night and took the body of Saul and the bodies of his sons from the wall, and they came to Jabesh and burned them there, and they took their bones and buried them under the tamarisk tree in Jabesh and fasted 7 days. So now all the men, even though all of Saul's army, it seems like, was defeated, there were still brave men. And when these men heard about what had happened, they go into this city, probably at night, and they reclaim the bodies. Okay? And then they take them, and I guess probably these bodies were very mutilated. And so they burned the bodies, which was not something that they normally did in Israel, but they, for whatever reason, they burn the bodies, and then they take the bones and bury them. And then they go into a period of fasting, it says, and mourning for 7 days. And so this is the end of Saul. I mean, like I said, a man who started out really well, and he ends up with his body hung on a wall of the enemy. And some guys have to come and rescue him. Let's go to now 2 Samuel and follow what happened. Now it came about after the death of Saul, when David had returned from the slaughter of the Amalekites, that David remained 2 days in Ziklag. And it happened on the 3rd day that, behold, a man came out of the camp from Saul with his clothes torn and dust on his head. So that's a symbol of mourning, right? When they were mourning, they put dust on their head. So it's a symbol of grief. He's come from the battle. He's seen all these bodies laying there that have been slain, both Philistines and Israelites. And so he comes to David. And it came about when he came to David that he fell to the ground, prostrated himself. And then David said to him, so he's showing respect to David. It's a sign of respect what he does. And David said to him, from where do you come? And he said to him, I have escaped from the camp of Israel. And David said to him, how did things go? Please tell me. And he said, the people have fled from the battle, and also many of the people have fallen and are dead, and Saul and Jonathan and his sons are also dead. Okay, so this is not good news for David. David was never, even though Saul had constantly tried to pursue David, tried to kill David on a number of occasions, David was not. His heart was different than Saul's, and so he's not going to be happy about this. Okay, even though this means an end to this part of it, we're going to watch David. David's going to grieve now. So it said, and David said to the young men who told him, how do you know that Saul and Jonathan are dead? And the young man told him, by chance I happened to be on Mount Gilboa, and behold, Saul was leaning on his spear, and behold, the chariots and the horsemen pursued him closely. And when he looked behind him, he saw me and called to me, and I said, here am I. And he said to me, who are you? And I answered to him, I am an Amalekite. Then he said to me, please stand beside me and kill me, for agony has seized me, because my life still lingers in me. So I stood beside him and killed him because I knew that he could not live after he had fallen. And I took the crown which was on his head and the bracelet which was on his arm, and I brought them here to you, my Lord. So now there's a different story, right? In the first story we saw at the end of 1 Samuel, it says that Saul fell on his sword, and when his shield bearer, when he saw that he was dead, he killed himself as well. So we don't know if this guy's come out with a lie. You know, is this a made-up story, or did his Saul's companion think that he was dead, and this guy comes along and Saul hasn't finished the job? And so if that's the case, then he's thinking, let's say that if he's being honest, he's thinking he's doing a good thing, right? Saul was going to die. He was already mortally wounded. Saul said, please go ahead, finish me off. And so he thinks that he's doing a good thing. Unless he just absolutely lied about it, thinking he would gain David's favor because he knew that David was going to be the next king. So we don't really know which story took place. They're both feasible. And so then in verse 11 then says, David took hold of his clothes, David's clothes, and tore them, and so did all the men that were with him. So David's got his bodyguards, his generals, his captains with him, and he begins mourning. What do you think about that? The guy that was the biggest pain in your neck has been taken out, and David's grieving. What? Okay, so maybe it's more for Jonathan. I think it's for both. As we'll see when we read on with this, I think we're going to see that he was for both. Yeah, but I think one of the things that we see, David is an unusual man because there's sometimes when he gets it right, he really gets it right, and there's sometimes he doesn't get it right at all. You know, as we'll see as we go through this first this chapter today. I mean, it's amazing how he is. Okay, they mourned and wept and fasted until evening for Saul and his son Jonathan and for the people of the Lord and the house of Israel because they had fallen by the sword. So it's the whole group that they're mourning for right now, right? And David said to the young man who told him, where are you from? And he answered, I am a son of an alien, an Amalekite. And then David said to him, how is it that you were not afraid to stretch out your hand and destroy the Lord's anointed? Okay? David would not touch the Lord's anointed. David would not let his men touch the Lord's anointed. And so he says to this guy, what made you think you could do this? What made you think you could lift your hand against the king that had been anointed by God? So you see, David has a great, great respect for the activity of God in people's lives. God had anointed Saul. And David had said, I am not going to do anything to the Lord's anointed. If the Lord chooses to take him out, he takes him out. But he would not do anything, and he would not allow his men to do anything. And so there's an attitude that David has about this whole thing. Okay? And about the Lord and the Lord's activity and interfering with God. Okay? Interfering with what God's doing. Okay?
This guy would have just left him out to die and went and told David that, David would probably killed him anyway.
Maybe not. We don't know. Well, he wouldn't have got him for putting his hand against the Lord's anointed for sure, you know. And David called to one of the young men and said, go, cut him down. So he struck him down. So, I mean, I don't think that's what the guy was expecting. He brings the crown, he brings the jewelry, he brings the stuff that's left there, and he comes back and he winds up being killed for this. Isn't it interesting that when they came and they got Saul and they found him, they took his sword and his weapons and stuff. So apparently this guy was there first because he took the crown and that, so that was already missing when the Philistines came back for him. And David said to him, your blood is on your head, for your mouth has testified against you, saying, I have killed the Lord's anointed. And so now what we have is a psalm, if you will, a poem, a chant that David writes about Saul and his son Jonathan. And so they said that it's in the book of Jasher, And that apparently was a book of poems. We don't have that, but apparently this was something that they knew about. And so it says, your beauty, O Israel, is slain on your high place. How have the mighty fallen? So who are the mighty? Saul, Jonathan, Israel, yeah. So how have the mighty fallen? Tell it not in Gath. Proclaim it not in the streets of Ashkelon. Or the daughters of the Philistines will rejoice. The daughters of the uncircumcised will exult. So what's he saying? Don't spread the news. Because what they're going to do is they're going to celebrate. They're going to celebrate. And we see that. We still see that in the Middle East now, right? We see that and we've seen it multiple times on our news when the terrorists get an American or an Israeli or someone like that, and then they drag them through the streets and people are out dancing and shouting and clapping and celebrating. It hasn't changed. That whole dynamic has not changed, which is amazing since we're centuries beyond that. It's been 2,000 years since Christ. It's probably 2,000 or 3,000 years before Christ when this took place. And so let's say for 5,000 years it's not changed. They still do the same thing. Hatred can last forever, can it? At least for a very long time. Maybe not forever, because the Lord's coming back. But think about what he's talking about here. O mountains of Gilboa, let not the dew or rain be on you, nor the fields of offering. For there the shield of the mighty was defiled, and the shield of Saul not anointed with oil. So he's saying right now, weep. He's wanting the nature to weep the loss of Saul, to grieve the loss of Saul. So let there not be dew or rain. From the blood of the slain, from the fat of the mighty, the bow of Jonathan did not turn back, and the sword of Saul did not return empty. So see, he's exalting both Jonathan and Saul. He says, Jonathan didn't run. He was there with his bow shooting as long as there was life in him. Saul did not run. And that's one thing we've got to say. Saul didn't. His men may have been fleeing, but apparently Saul didn't join them. He was still there in the battle. Saul and Jonathan, beloved and pleasant in their life, and in their death they were not parted. They were swifter than eagles. They were stronger than lions. O daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothed you luxuriously in scarlet, who put ornaments of gold on your apparel. How have the mighty fallen in the midst of the battle? Okay, so we see he still has a very high regard for Saul. I mean, and that's different because probably most of us, if we had someone that was after us like Saul, we wouldn't have this kind of regard for them, right? We probably celebrate, God took him out. Finally, he's delivered me, right? And so this is not David's heart. And that's one of the things that makes David different from most people. That's why God calls him a man after his own heart. Then he talks about Jonathan. Jonathan is slain on your high places. I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. So here's where Keith was talking about. He has this great relationship with Jonathan. So he says, I'm distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. You've been very pleasant to me. Your love to me was more wonderful than the love of women. How have the mighty fallen and the weapons of war perished? And so this is his ode. This is his tribute, if you will, to Saul, to Jonathan, and to the Israelites that died. Okay? And so that's how this particular chapter ends after he finds. So David immediately goes into a state of grieving. For chapter 2, then it came about afterwards that David inquired of the Lord, saying, shall I go up to one of the cities of Judah? And the Lord said to him, go up. So David said, where shall I go up? And he said, to Hebron. Okay, so now what we see is even though David had kind of walked away for a while when he was with the Philistines, he comes back to God, and the first thing he does is before he makes any movement, he doesn't go in immediately and say, okay, you all know I'm the anointed, I'm coming in to claim my right is to be the king of Israel. He goes to God first. His first thing is, should I go back into Israel? Remember he's at Ziklag. Should I go back into Israel? God says, go. And so he then says, where do you want me to go? Do you want me to go to Jerusalem? Do you want me to go? Where do you want me to go? And he says, go to Hebron. Okay? And so it says in verse 2, so David went up there with his two wives, Ahinoam and Abigail. Okay, so right now he's got two. Remember, he's got three, right? Was married to Saul's daughter. Saul took her away, gave her to the man when David fled. So now he's got two wives that he's living with. This is not according to the Old Testament law. He's supposed to only have one wife as a king. He's not supposed to have multiple wives, but he does. Okay? And David brought up his men who were with him, each with his household, and they lived in the cities of Hebron. And then the men of Judah came there and anointed him king over the house of Judah. So this is the second anointing that David has. The first anointing was with Samuel, when Samuel says that God has chosen you to be king. Now he comes in, and the men of Judah, which is a tribe of Judah. So this is one of the tribes. There's how many tribes? 12. And so one of the tribes, he's come into their area, and they come to him, and they anoint him to be king. This is 15 years after the first time he was anointed. There's this second anointing, okay? And so they're pledging basically their belief that he is God's chosen to be the king, the next king. And they want him to be they want David to be their king, okay? And then David said to the men of Jabesh Gilead who buried Saul, David sent messengers to the men and said to them, "May you be blessed of the Lord, because you have shown kindness to Saul your Lord and have buried him. And now may the Lord show loving kindness and truth to you, and I will also show this goodness to you, because you have done this thing. Now therefore let your hands be strong and be valiant. For Saul, your Lord, is dead. Also the house of Judah has anointed me king over them." So what's David doing here? Okay, yeah, he's honoring these men that had risked their life to go get Saul. That's one thing. That's absolutely true. What else? He's doing what?
He's calling the men up.
Okay, what do you mean?
Those same men that were valiant.
Yeah.
And everyone else had fled.
Yeah.
He's calling them up.
Okay, so he's recognizing them. And when you mean calling them up, you mean calling them to him?
Yeah.
Okay. I think he's doing that, but I think he's giving them the option there. They're not coming up yet, but he's opening the door he's working his way into taking over all of Israel. And so he's honoring these men, and he said, "You're not going to have any trouble out of me. I will protect you, I'll honor you, I'll do this," which opens the door then for what you're saying, for them to come and join with him at some point. So David is a smart guy. I mean, he's a smart guy. But Abner, the son of Ner, commander of Saul's army, had taken Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, and brought him over to Mahanaim, and he made him king over Gilead and over the Asherites and the Jezreel and over Ephraim and Benjamin and even over all Israel. So what we have here now, we have Abner, who was Saul's general, who apparently doesn't get killed in the battle, and he goes, there's one of Saul's sons left, and so he goes to this son and he makes him king. Okay? And so most believe that this is kind of a puppet king, if you will, because this guy wasn't out in battle. He wasn't fighting alongside with the rest of them. And so he was probably weaker and not a military kind of guy. But Abner, being Saul's general, knows of this guy. And so he goes and he gets him and he appoints him to be king. Okay? And he has some precedence for doing this, because usually when the king dies, what happens? An heir becomes king. And so this is probably the only living heir at this point that's a son, and so he makes him king over Israel. The time that David was king in Hebron over the house of Judah was 7 years and 6 months. Okay, so now for 7 years and 6 months we have a divided kingdom. We have Ishbosheth over Israel, and we have David over Judah. Okay? David doesn't push this. Okay? I mean, David had every right to claim all of Israel, didn't he? God had anointed him the next king over Israel. But David waits 7.5 years. What do you think about that? What does that say about David? Patient, okay? What else? That's true. He did. He waited on God. He waited on God's timing. He didn't go in and force it. He didn't take it over. He simply waited on the timing of the Lord. How hard is that? Real hard. Real hard. Yes, sir.
Well, how is it that Ish?
Yeah, just call him Ish. We'll call him Ish. That's easier for all of us.
Ruled for 2 years. And what happened that 4 or so years that he saved?
I don't know. It doesn't tell us. You know, I mean, it just tells us this guy did for like two years and David for 7.5 years. But we don't know all the dynamics, and our scriptures never always gives us moment by moment stuff. You know, it gives us what they want us to know, and that's just kind of fill in the blanks. Now, Abner, the son of Ner, went out to Gibeon with the servants of Ish, the son of Saul, and Joab, the son of Zeruiah, and the servants of David went out and met them by the pool of Gibeon, and they sat down one on one side and one on the other side of the pool, and the other side of the pool. So what happens is that Zeruiah, does anybody know who Zeruiah is? It's David's sister. Okay, this is David's sister. And so her sons, Joab, who's Joab? Joab is David's commander of his military. Okay? And so it's also his what? Nephew. Right? But since David was the youngest of Jesse's kids, he could have been even older than David. So we don't know. But you got kind of a family dynamic here if we take a look at it. So you got Joab, who is the nephew of David, who serves David, but he's also the commander of David's army. Okay? And then he's got his 2 brothers with him. So what happens is Abner comes up, and they're at this pool, and Abner has some men with him, and they're on one side, and Joab has some men, and they're on one side. Okay, and then Abner said, hey, let's let the young men arise and hold a contest before us. And so Joab said, let them arise. So they arose and went over by count 12 for Benjamin and Ishbosheth, and 12 for the servants of David. Okay, so you're going to do battle, and you got 12 on each side. Okay, and then what happens is it tells us something amazing happened. It said each one of them seized his opponent by his head and thrust his sword in his opponent's side, so they fell together. Therefore, that place was called Helkei, and I can pronounce all that one, which is in Gibeon. So what happens is these 12 guys from each side, 24 men come up, they grab each other, they stick each other in the side, and they fall dead together. Kind of a strange contest, isn't it? You know. Does it sound like they're drunk? Okay. So then what happened is apparently there's a battle that takes place that day. Verse 17, that day the battle was very severe, and Abner and his men of Israel were beaten before the servants of David. So apparently this was to be a contest to see who wins. There was a draw there because they each killed each other, so then they have this battle. Now the 3 sons of Zeruiah were Joab, Abishai, and Ashiel. Ashiel was as swift-footed as one of the gazelles which is in the field. And so what happens is they have this battle, and Israel loses, and so they begin to retreat, and this son of David's, one of his nephews, begins to chase Abner, okay? He starts chasing him, is what we're going to see in here. And then Abner looked behind him and said, hey, look, I don't want to kill you, boy. Just going back home, right? I mean, I'm just going to paraphrase a little bit because I don't have time to read it all. But he says, I'm not going to kill you. Just going home. And he doesn't believe him. And so he's coming after him, right? And so then Joab takes his weapon and puts it through his stomach. Comes out his back, we're told. And he kills him there on the spot. So now that's going to create bad blood between Joab and Abner. Okay? And so that there's going to be a lot of things that happen because of that. Okay? And so and you can read the rest of this where there is this battle, and what we find out in the battle was that there were 19 of David's men that were killed and 360 of Abner's. So we see now that you've got Israelites fighting against Israelites at this point, right? And so David's group is winning. Okay? So now, verse 1 of chapter 3, now there was a long war between the house of Saul and the house of David. And David grew steadily stronger, but the house of Saul grew weaker and weaker. So probably what's happening in those years you're talking about, there's still a battle. They're still warring against each other. They're not ready to settle that. You know, and we're reminded here that it can take a long time to resolve conflict. Not all conflict's settled peaceably or quickly, because it says it's a long battle. And then it goes in and talks about this. And so during this 7-year period, somehow or another, David acquires 4 more wives. Okay? And so we see that he has sons were born to David at Hebron. The firstborn was Amnon by Ahinadam. The second, Sheleab, who's also known as Daniel, by Abigail. Then there's the third one is Absalom. The fourth one is Adonijah. Then it's a different mom. And you can go and read all of those. And so he's got these 6 kids by 6 different women. 6 different wives.
He's starting to act like Saul to me.
Starting to act like Solomon to me. You know, but yeah. Because I don't know that we see that Saul has multiple wives, did we? I don't remember Saul having multiple wives, but for whatever reason, David decides to do this, and so he's got all these kids here, okay? And it says, and it came about, verse 6, while there was war between the house of, turn to me page, Saul and the house of David, that Abner was making himself strong in the house of Saul. So Abner's working toward being over Israel. Now Saul had a concubine whose name was Rizpah, the daughter of Aha. And so what happened is Ishbosheth comes to Abner because Abner, and he accuses Abner of having relations with his father's concubine. Okay? Now, again, that's part of the culture, but the concubines, the wives and concubines of Saul, and apparently he does have more, Jerry, you're right, that you leave them alone. They were his. They're not to be touched. They're to be left alone. And so Abner comes in, and what does Abner do? Apparently, he's accused of having relations with one. I mean, he'd fit into some of our government officials' lives, right? So he's committed to having relationships with one of these concubines. And so Abner's really angry because Ish has challenged him. And he said, am I a dog's head that belongs to Judah? Today I show kindness to the house of Saul, your father, to your brothers, and to his friends, and have not destroyed you into the hands of David, or have not delivered you into the hands of David, and yet today you charge me with the guilt concerning the woman. So what's happened? How does he respond? He's mad. He's not a happy camper. Probably because he's guilty. All right? But he comes in, so he warns him. And may God do to Abner and more also, as if the Lord has sworn to David, I will not accomplish this for him, to transfer the kingdom from the house of Saul, to establish the throne of David over Israel, over Judah, from Dan even to Beersheba. So what does Abner know? He knows that God has promised David that David's going to be the king. That David is his chosen, but what's he doing? He's going against what he knows to be God's plan. He sets up a kingdom for him, basically for himself, and he's growing stronger and stronger, and Saul's son Ish is getting weaker and weaker. And so now what happens is, verse 11 said, and he could no longer answer Abner a word because he was afraid of him. And so now Abner is a perfect illustration of a bully. And so he bullies basically Ish into saying, hey, I will turn this whole thing over to David if you mess with me. It's kind of the warning there, okay? And so the guy's afraid, so he does not challenge Abner anymore. And then Abner sent messages to David in his place, saying, Whose is the land? Make your covenant with me, and behold, my hand shall be with you to bring all of Israel over to you. So apparently this really offended Abner, so he's trying to make a covenant now with David. And he said, good, I'll make a covenant with you, but I demand one thing of you, namely, that you shall not see my face unless you first bring Michal, Saul's daughter, when you come to me. Okay, so what's he asking now? He's wanting the first wife back. What happened to the first wife? Saul gave her to another man. So she's living with a second husband, if you will, living as his wife. And David says, there's no deal. There's no negotiation. You won't even see my face if you don't bring her back to me. Okay? And so we're not sure what that's all about, except that's what he says. Okay? And so David sent messengers to Ish, Saul's son, saying, give me my wife, to whom I was betrothed, for 100 foreskins of the Philistines. And Ish sent and took her from her husband, and then he takes her, and so he goes and he gets her. So her brother goes and pulls her away from her second husband, and he's taking her to David. Her second husband is distraught, and what we find if we read through this is he's following her, begging and pleading and crying that they not do this. Okay? And it says, and Abner looked at him and said, go and return. And so he returned. 17, Abner had consultation with the elders of Israel, saying, in times past you were seeking for David to be king over you. Now then, do it. For the Lord has spoken of David, saying, by the hand of my servant David, I will save my people Israel from the hand of the Philistines and from the hand of all of their enemies. And Abner also spoke in the hearing of Benjamin. In addition, Abner went to speak in the hearing of David in Hebron, and all seemed good to Israel and the whole house of Benjamin. So now it's kind of interesting that I think Abner sees the handwriting on the wall, so now he's going to negotiate. And so he's going to all the different tribes, and he's saying, God has said David is going to be the one that's going to be king. David is going to be the one that's going to save Israel. It's time for us to join him. Okay? So it's politicking for this consolidation. And then Abner and 20 men with him came to David at Hebron. And David made a feast for Abner and the men who were with him. And Abner said to David, let me arise and go and gather all Israel to my lord the king, that they may make a covenant with you, and that you may be king over all that your soul desires. So David sent Abner away, and he went in peace. So now we've got Abner working to bring Israel to David. David's saying, okay, I'm good with this. Go do it. But now we're going to see something else unfold here now, and we'll finish this chapter up. And behold, the servants of David and Joab came from a raid and brought much spoil with them. But Abner was not with David in Hebron, for he had sent him away, and he had gone in peace. And when Joab and all the army that was with him arrived, they told Joab, saying, Abner the son of Ner came to the king, and he has sent him away, and he has gone in peace. So now why would this be an issue for Joab? Killed his brother. Okay? Then Joab came to the king and said, what have you done? Behold, Abner came to you. Why have you then sent him away, and he is already gone? Okay, now that's his uncle, so he can talk a little bit more freely with him, right? Because they're family. And Abner the son of Ner, that he came to deceive you and to learn of your going out and your coming in, to find all that you're doing. And when Joab came out from David, he sent messengers after Abner, and they brought him back from the well at Sarah, and David did not know it. So what is Joab saying? Abner's a spy. He's a spy. He's making you think that he's on your side, but he's really not on your side. He is out to destroy you. It's whether he believes that or not, that's what he's saying. So then what does he do? He goes outside of David. He undermines what David's doing, and he sends men to get Abner. Now what's Abner at this point? Abner's clueless, right? That this is what's going on, and he thinks he's in a good relationship with David. He left in peace. So if David sends for him, it would make sense that he would return to David, right? Because everything's supposed to be good. And so it says, when he returned, Joab took him aside into the middle of the gate to speak with him privately, and there he struck him in the belly so that he died on account of the blood of Asahel, his brother. So what does he do? He assassinates him. So he's getting his revenge. He's getting even. Afterward, David heard of it. He said, I and my kingdom are innocent before the Lord forever of the blood of Abner, the son of Ner. May it fall on the head of Joab and on all his father's house, and may there not fail from the house of Joab one who has discharge, or who is a leper, or who takes hold of the staff, or who falls by the sword, or who lacks bread. And so what does David do? David said, I have nothing to do with this. The Lord's going to deal with you, and it's going to be basically a curse on this family. Okay? His sister's family. Her sons and her grandsons. And so this whole dynamic that takes place here is really weird in some ways to the way that we look at things. Okay? And so Joab and Abishai, his brother, killed Abner because he had put their brother Asahel to death in the battle of Gibeon. And then David said to Joab and to all the people who were with him, tear your clothes and gird your sackcloth and lament for Abner. And King David walked behind the bier. And thus they buried Abner in Hebron, and the king lifted up his voice and wept at the grave of Abner, and all the people wept. And then the king chanted a lament for Abner and said, should Abner die as a fool dies? Your hands were not bound, nor your feet in feathers. As one falls before the wicked, you have fallen. And all the people wept over him. So what do you think's going on there?
David had promised to protect Abner.
Okay.
And so when he was killed, that made it look like David may have participated in it. So he was wanting to make sure everybody understood that he did not take part in it.
Okay, so he's making sure that everybody knows he's not part of this. I think there's something else there. I think that's certainly possible. I think there's something else there. We got to remember that all these guys at one time were warriors together. They were all part of Saul's army. And David was leading the military, and Abner was in that military, and Joab was in that military, and all these guys were soldiers together. And then you have this division, and some of the guys come after David, but the majority stayed with Saul. And so what happens is that there were relationships. And we would think that when these guys go into battle together, they fought side by side against the different enemies of Israel. And so there was a bond there. And even though they were on different sides, David never held that against them. David never held it against Abner and the other Israelite military men that they stayed with Saul. He never once blamed them for that. You see, and so it was easy for those guys to come back in under David as king because David did not have any animosity. Now Saul would have had a ton of animosity against him, right? He would have had them killed when they came back. David wasn't that way. His heart was different. He understood the position those guys were in, and he didn't blame them for staying with Saul. And so I think that you're right, Susie. I think that he did not want the nation, the people, to think he had anything to do with this. But I think he was genuinely grieved by the loss of another man that he respected. You know, we read about it even in our own history where there were people. I read one time, I forgot what the Indian chief was, but he talked about George Washington and how Washington would come out in battle and how they would have him in their sights of their arrows, and they would shoot and they'd miss him. And he would just ride up and down, and they just believed that he could not be killed and they had such respect for Washington, and even though they were enemies. And what we find in a lot of cases, military leaders who do battle against each other will have respect for their opponent. And we see this with David. We see David having a deep respect for this man. Even though they had different sides, even though they were different, even though in many ways Abner tried to take part of the kingdom from David, David still respected him. And so he has a lament. It's not as long as it was for Saul. It's not as long as it was for David. But it says that, should you die as a fool? Your hands were not bound. Your feet were not put in feathers. As one falls before the wicked, you have fallen. And so all the people wept again. And so we see that the nation's following David's lead. And it's about that, almost that time. Then all the people came to persuade David to eat bread while it was still day. But David vowed, saying, may God do so to me and more if I taste any bread or anything else before the sun goes down. Now all the people took note of it, and it pleased them, just as everything the king did pleased all the people. So all the people of Israel understood that day that it had not been the will of the king to put Abner the son of Ner to death. And then the king said to the servants, do you not know that a prince and a great man has fallen this day in Israel? I am weak today, though anointed king, and these men, the sons of Zeruiah, are too difficult for me. May the Lord repay evil doing according to his evil. And so David then, the people are pleased with this. David doesn't go back into his home and eat. He says, no, I'm going to fast today. I'm fasting over the loss of what he believes to be was a great man. And so we can see David is, when we look in Israel, David is cut out of a different cloth. And the people look at him and they respect him. I mean, here was a guy that nobody would have blamed him if he would have been behind it, right? Because of what Abner had done. But David isn't that way. And so we're beginning to see why God looks at David in such a special way, even though David has his flaws. I would consider 6 wives, 7 wives to be a flaw, okay? And to be contrary to what God teaches in Deuteronomy. So even though he has his flaws, God still is working in his life. Any questions or comments or anything you want to share before we close? Or anything you want to ask?
That's just the same way that he works in our lives, because we're definitely not perfect. We make wrong choices and bad decisions, and still, with us, and helping us in our life, even when we make mistakes.
That's absolutely true. I think it's a good thing to help us look at David and see that we understand that we're not perfect, nor was David perfect, and that God works through imperfect people. And that we're grateful for his mercy and his grace and his, as he said in Isaiah, his ways aren't our ways. And if you go back in and you look at the beginning of that passage in Isaiah, it's a passage that begins about forgiveness. And he's talking about forgiving, and then he says, my ways are not your ways, my ways are higher than your ways. And he goes through that big thing. And so, one of the things that's big for God, and I'm very, very grateful that it's big for God, is forgiveness. And one of the things that's big for God is that his children forgive when we've been harmed, when we've been hurt. And David is a model of that, at least at this point in his life. All right, thank you. Let me pray and we'll end tonight. Father, again, thank you for this time we could come together, study your word. God, thank you for each person here. May you bless them. May you lead them. May you direct them. May you, God, be honored. And may we have a heart like David for you and for others. May we be people with a short memory when it comes to grievances against someone. And may we be people who are really ready to forgive and to be reconciled. May we not be like Joab and just be bitter and have hatred in our heart to kill someone else. And this was done in battle. And actually, when we look at this, Abner was trying to protect himself. He did not have any choice. He tried to talk this young man down. The young man wouldn't do it. And so he was defending himself. So it was part of a battle. So God, help us to understand that life is not easy. It's complicated. And sometimes we can bring our destruction on ourselves if we're not careful. Again, we praise you. We thank you for all you're doing in our midst. May you continue to work in a strong and mighty way. In Christ's name, amen. Appreciate it. Thank you.